Critical race theory is teaching your 6-year-old to hate America, to hate white people. I heard a coworker of mine say something like that in our cafeteria recently. He wasn't yelling, but he said it with that deep word certainty you often hear on the news. He was genuinely concerned that his granddaughter's kindergarten class would be turned into some kind of re-education camp. And then shortly after that, I was reading an academic paper by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was describing critical race theory as a graduate level framework for examining our legal system. This is something you'd be hard pressed to find anywhere near a kindergarten class. So what's the truth here? Is it a dangerous tool for indoctrinating children or a complex academic theory for law students? The gap between these two descriptions is striking, don't you think? And more importantly, how did a set of ideas that began in a quiet law seminar back in the 1970s become the source of shouting matches at school board meetings all across our country? The panic is real, y'all, and the arguments are loud in places where the core concepts are so profoundly misunderstood. My hope today, though, is that we can open up a real conversation, one grounded in understanding, and begin to dispel some of the myths. So we're going to step away from the noise and walk metaphorically into a university classroom where it all began. We're going to unpack the 4 foundational ideas that have been transformed from an academic lens on race into one of the loudest and most misunderstood cultural debates of our time. This isn't about taking sides. It's about a genuine effort to understand. So I hope you'll stick with me, because by the end of our time together, you won't just have a clearer picture of what this theory actually is. You'll be better equipped to explain with calm and clarity why some people see these ideas as profound insights, while others believe they represent a threat to the values they hold so dear. It's time we traded the heat of the debate for the light of understanding. Life is always moving, like waves on the ocean. Some rise gentle, some crash hard, but every wave carries the chance to begin again. I'm Vanessa, and welcome to Waves of Change, a space for mindset, mindfulness, and the things that truly matter. Together we'll pause, breathe, and remember, you're never too late, and your peace is never too far. Let's picture the scene. It's 1978. America is still navigating the aftershocks of the civil rights movement, and many of the hard-won gains are already still facing challenges. Affirmative action is being fought fiercely in the courts. In this environment, a brilliant young Harvard law student, Kimberly Crenshaw, noticed something that troubled her. She saw that her classmates, though well-intentioned, often treated race as a footnote in legal discussions, an afterthought, rather than a fundamental piece of the story of justice in America. They would analyze cases through the lens of class or gender, but race often seemed to be on the periphery, as if the law itself could operate in a colorblind vacuum. She and a handful of other forward-thinking students, many of them veterans of the civil rights marches, started asking a deeply important, if uncomfortable, question. What if racism isn't just about the prejudice in individual hearts, but about the very rules of the game? What if our legal system, even after the Civil Rights Act, was still structured in the ways that produced unequal outcomes? This wasn't just a casual question. It was a foundational challenge to the way law was being taught and understood. To explore this, they looked to an emerging field called critical legal studies, or CLS, which argued that law is not always a neutral, objective force, but a system that can protect existing structures of power. Crenshaw and her peers embraced this critique and added a vital component: race. They felt that even CLS hadn't fully grappled with race as its own unique and powerful force in American life. By 1989, this group of scholars held their first workshop, officially calling their framework critical race theory. This was no big media event. It was simply about 20 scholars, mostly people of color, in a room asking hard questions together. They came to see that a colorblind approach to law, the idea that if we just ignore race, equality will naturally follow, could still lead to profoundly colored outcomes. They understood that pretending to be neutral in the face of deep-seated inequality can often just reinforce that very inequality. That origin story is so important, y'all, because nearly every panicked headline we see today trace back in some distorted way to the kinds of questions they first asked. Questions like, is race a biological fiction that has become a powerful social fact used to organize our society? Is racism a routine, ordinary part of how our systems function rather than just a shocking act by a few bad apples? And do rights for marginalized groups tend to advance only when they also happen to align with the interest of the powerful elite? If we can sit with those three questions, we're already moving beyond the caricature and closer to the core of the conversation. Let's start with a thought experiment from our own history. When the U.S. Census first offered Irish as a distinct category, were the Irish considered white? In the 1850s, the answer for many was no. Irish immigrants were often depicted as a separate, inferior race, caricatured in newspapers, denied jobs, and subject to harsh discrimination. They were not seen as a part of the dominant white Anglo-Saxon group. But let's fast forward to 1900. By then, the answer had become yes. Through a complex process of political and economic assimilation, the Irish had largely been absorbed in the broader category of whiteness. The people were the same, but their position in the racial hierarchy had shifted dramatically, bringing with it very different social and economic opportunities. This isn't just a historical anecdote. It's a powerful illustration of one of CRT's core ideas, that race is a social construct. It is not a fixed biological reality written into our DNA. There is no race gene. Instead, it's a story that societies create to organize people and distribute power, resources, and opportunity. And these stories change over time, often to serve the interests of those in charge. Once you see race as a fluid social idea, you stop looking for racism in individual hearts alone. Instead, you start asking a more useful question. Which of our rules, our policies, and our institutions are built on a particular racial story, and who benefits from it? Let's look at a concrete example, the 1934 Federal Housing Act. The law didn't have language that said, let's be racist, but it created a system where bankers were encouraged to draw red lines on the maps around black neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining, and label home loans in those areas as too risky. The federal government then insured mortgages, but almost exclusively for safe, meaning white neighborhoods. The result? Generations of white families were able to get cheap government-backed loans to buy homes and build wealth, what some have called a 30-year wealth rocket. At the very same time, black families in redline areas were locked out of that same opportunity. The policy didn't need to mention race. It just used the language of risk. But by linking race to risk, it created a system of racial inequality, proving you can build discriminatory structures without ever saying the quiet part out loud. Now let's turn to the second big idea. Many of us grew up with the story that racism is an ugly belief held by a few prejudiced individuals. And in that story, the solution is to educate the bigot and pass laws against their most explicit acts of discrimination. Racism is seen as a bug in a system that is otherwise working just fine. But CRT offers a different perspective, that racism isn't a glitch. It can be the default setting. It's ordinary, woven into the fabric of our institutions in ways that can almost be invisible. Like the Wi-Fi that connects automatically in your home. You don't have to choose it, it's just there, operating in the background and shaping outcomes, even when no single person intends to be discriminatory. Need an example? Consider the groundbreaking fair housing study from 1987. Researchers sent applicants who were identical in every way, same income, same family profile, to apply for housing. The only difference was that some were white and others were black and Latino. The real estate agents they met weren't shouting slurs. They were professional and polite. And yet, again and again, the black and Latino testers were shown fewer available homes and quoted higher prices. They were gently steered away from certain neighborhoods. It was all business as usual, but the outcomes were profoundly discriminatory. The machine wasn't broken, it was operating exactly as it had been built to, producing different results for different people. This idea of ordinary racism helps explain why diversity training that focuses only on making people feel good rarely leads to real change in outcomes. Because if racism is embedded in the rules and the structures of an organization, then simply changing a few hearts isn't enough. You have to be willing to look at the systems themselves. The problem isn't just about bad actors, it's about the stage on which we all perform. This next idea comes from a man often called the godfather of critical race theory, a brilliant legal scholar named Derek Bell. Bell observed a pattern in American history. Moments of significant racial progress often occurs when the interests of racial minorities converge with the interest of powerful white elites. His most famous case study was Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court decision that declared school segregation unconstitutional. It was a monumental, hard-won victory, but Bell pushed us to look deeper, arguing that Brown didn't happen only because America had a moral awakening. He pointed to the context of the Cold War. At the time, the United States was in a global battle of ideas with the Soviet Union, competing for the loyalty of newly independent nations like Asia and Africa. It was incredibly damaging for the U.S. to promote itself as a beacon of freedom and democracy while it practiced legally enforcing racial segregation at home. So while the moral courage of protesters were absolutely essential, Bell suggested that geopolitical interest in public relations also played a powerful role. The moral arguments alone had not been enough to carry the day. It was the convergence of that moral imperative with a strategic national interest that finally did it. Bell called this interest convergence. Progress on racial justice is more likely when the dominant power structure has something to gain from it. That something could be anything from international credibility to avoiding social unrest. Let's bring that idea to our time. After the George Floyd murder in 2020, we saw corporations across the country post black squares on social media and pledge millions to diversity initiatives. The lens of CRT invites us to ask, was this purely a moral awakening, or was it a calculated move to protect their brands from boycotts and bad press? Was it about genuine transformation, or was it about managing risk? CRT encourages that kind of healthy skepticism, urging us to look past symbolic gestures and search for deeper structural change. Now let's talk a moment about the concept that has become incredibly influential but is also deeply misunderstood: intersectionality. It's a term coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, the same person I mentioned earlier. She developed it to help us see a problem that the law was struggling to address. She noticed that a black woman who faced discrimination at work often fell through the cracks of our legal system. Her case might not fit into the box of sex discrimination, which often centered the experiences of white women, nor did it fit into the box of race discrimination, which often centered the experience of black men. Her experience was a unique combination of both. The legal framework was failing to see the overlapping or intersecting impact of being both black and a woman. Intersectionality simply proposes that if our map of the world only shows one road at a time, like the road of gender discrimination and the road of racial discrimination, we'll miss the traffic jam, the pileups that happen where those two roads cross. It's a tool that helps us recognize that people hold multiple identities: race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability, and that these identities intersect to create unique experiences of both privilege and oppression. The challenges a black gay man faces, for example, are distinct from those faced by white gay man or straight black man. Some critics have called this identity politics run amok, fearing it only serves to divide us. But for those who live at these intersections, it's a framework that finally gives voice to the complex reality of their lives. It's not about separating people, it's about seeing them more fully and understanding the systemic challenges they face. And whether you agree with it or not, this idea has entered our mainstream, influenced everything from HR policies to popular culture. All right, when we put these four ideas together, that race is a social construct, that racism can be an ordinary part of our systems, that progress often happens when interests converge, and that our identities intersect in complex ways, we start to see why this conversation can feel so challenging. It begins to shake the foundations of one of America's most cherished myths, the idea of a pure meritocracy. If race is a social invention used to distribute power, if racism is systemic, if progress can be conditional, and if we all have complex identities, then the ideal of colorblindness started to look less like a high moral principle and more like a form of willful blindness. It's like saying, I don't see color, when color has been a defining feature of people's lives and opportunities for centuries. And that, understandably, can be scary for a lot of folks. It could be unsettling for parents who have lovingly taught their children that hard work alone is the key to open every door. It can feel threatening to leaders who have built their careers on the idea that America has already solved its race problems. Acknowledging that the work isn't finished feels, to some, like a betrayal of a powerful and comforting national story. Then, you add to that a media environment where the most extreme voices are often amplified because outrage gets more clicks. This digital ecosystem can strip away a complex legal theory of all its nuances, transforming it into a soundbite designed to provoke an emotional reaction, which it did. And suddenly, a dense law school reading list becomes public enemy number one in state legislatures from Florida to Tennessee. The real-world consequences of this panic have been swift and deeply concerning. This movement has been used as a tool to whitewash American history. This isn't a new phenomenon. For over a century, groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy worked to ensure textbooks taught that the Civil War was about states' rights and glossed over the brutality of slavery. Today, this effort often takes the form of new laws restricting the teaching of so-called divisive concepts. Since 2021, at least 18 states have passed such rules, many using languages copied directly from an administration's executive orders. This phrase, divisive concepts, is then used as a weapon against any lesson or book that shines a light on systemic inequality or historical injustice. The results can be truly absurd. Teachers in Texas were reportedly told they needed to offer opposing views on the Holocaust, as if the genocide of 6 million Jews had a legitimate other side. Fearing criminal charges under vague new laws, some librarians in Florida have pulled memoirs by Black authors and even children's books about American heroes like Ruby Bridges. And here lies the profound irony. The actual academic work of Bell and Crenshaw was almost never a part of any K-12 curriculum in the first place. It's highly unlikely you will find a kindergarten teacher quoting from these complex legal texts between story time and snack break. So what was actually pulled from the shelves? it wasn't the graduate level CRT, it was children's books about segregation, honest discussions about Martin Luther King Jr.'s fight against systemic racism, and lessons on the true history of slavery. These are not academic theory, they are central parts of American history. Argue with me in the comments if you will, but facts are facts. Banning a theory that isn't even being taught, all to silence basic lessons in history and empathy, it's like outlawing quantum physics because you don't like how the microwave works. It's a performative act of censorship that ultimately harms our children's ability to understand the world they live in. Look, if this conversation is your first real introduction to these ideas, I hope you won't let the pundits on TV be your second. Let's not let the outrage machine dictate what we think. Instead, I invite you to go directly to the source. Pick up a copy of Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. It's a powerful and accessible book that uses stories to explore racial injustice. Or find Critical Race Theory, an introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik. It's short and written in remarkably plain language. You don't need a law degree to understand it. Engage with the actual arguments yourself, and then see where the facts lead and where you might find common ground with your coworkers who have this idea of what critical race theory is. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about fostering genuine understanding. The only way to cut through all the noise is to engage with substance. Before I close today, it is so important that we clear away some of the most damaging myths. To have an honest conversation, we have to know what we're actually talking about and what we're not talking about. First, CRT is not a program that teaches that all white people are inherently or personally racist. This is a harmful mischaracterization. The scholars in this field focus on systems and policies, not on assigning blame to individuals based on their skin color. It's about the impact of structures, not the moral character of individuals. Second, it is not taught in most K-12 classrooms. Period. Critical race theory is a graduate level academic framework. What is being taught in our schools are lessons about American history, including slavery, segregation, and the civil rights movement. That is not CRT. That is simply a responsible and comprehensive education. Third, CRT is not a blueprint for a race war. This is a fear-mongering distortion. The goal of this framework is to better explain inequality and critique systems in hope of creating a more just society for everyone. It's an analytical tool for diagnosis, not a prescription for division. And finally, CRT is not a catch-all term for anything about race that makes us uncomfortable. Too often, any discussion of historical injustice or systemic racism gets intentionally mislabeled as CRT as a way to shut down the conversation. That kind of intellectual sloppiness is a barrier to progress. Our democracy and our ability to understand one another depends on us using words with honesty and precision. So what does this all mean for us in our everyday lives? It means that you don't need a law degree to start thinking like a critical theorist. You can start by simply asking a new set of questions about the world around you. The practice is simple. When you come across a policy, a system, or a social outcome, just ask, who does this policy or system truly serve? Whose story might be missing from this narrative? And where does the money flow? Who benefits financially from things being structured this way? Try it with something as mundane as the placement of red light cameras, the way public schools are funded in your town, or the promotion process at your job. You'll start noticing the kinds of structural biases that the official explanations often miss. You'll see how policies that seem neutral on the surface can have vastly different impacts on different communities. Whether you end up embracing this theory or critiquing it, the most important thing is this. you'll be engaging with the real idea, not the caricature that's been set on fire for ratings. And that is always a more productive and honest way to engage with our world. More than 40 years ago, a small group of law students dared to ask a profound question. What if the problem isn't just about bad people, but about flawed structures that perpetuated injustice, even when individuals have good intentions? That question has proven to be incredibly persistent. It has survived attacks, bans, and countless social media pylons. It endures because it helps explain things that our simple, colorblind stories often can't. It helps us understand how a nation can outlaw segregation and declare legal equality, yet still see such deep inequality in its outcomes. Panic and understanding rarely travel in the same direction. That's why we took this journey today, to move past the fear and toward a place of clarity. My hope is that we can start a new kind of conversation, one based not on fear, but on a shared desire to understand. If you learned something today, if this helped demystify the debate for you, please share this video. Maybe even share it with that person you're likely to argue with at your job or in your family, and encourage them to discuss it with an open mind and a respectful heart. Do me a favor and subscribe for more conversations that aim to trade the heat of division for the light of understanding. Hey y'all, I'm Vanessa. This is Ways of Change. This is not my usual topics of conversation, but I felt it was really important to share this information. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you the next time. Remember, you're never too late and your peace is never too far. Thanks. Bye.